And we are live. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone on YouTube and on Facebook. Welcome to a very special launch event for The Fallen by Ada Hoffmann. I'm delighted to be here on behalf of Angry Robot Books. I'm Sam, the publishing assistant, jack of all trades, social media person for Angry Robot. It's my first time hosting one of our book launches, which I'm very excited to be doing. And I'm delighted to be joined tonight by both Ada Hoffmann, the author of The Fallen and The Outside, and also by Janelle Shane. So I'm going to introduce them one by one and let them tell you a little bit about themselves, and then we'll go into our wonderful Q&A conversation. So first of all, Ada Hoffmann, author of The Fallen and The Outside. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and about your wonderful books? And there they are.
All right, so my name is Ada. I am a Canadian science fiction author, and I am the author of the Outside series, which is a cosmic horror space opera. So The Outside, which was nominated for the Philip K. Dick Award, came out in 2019. And The Fallen is the sequel to that book. It's actually going to be a trilogy. So this is book 2 in a trilogy. And The Fallen just came out on Tuesday. So it's very brand new. And as you might expect, in this genre, quite a lot of terrible things happened in the first book, which I will try not to spoil. And The Fallen is a book that picks up 6 months later. It's very much about how people are coping in the aftermath of the first book. And so there's a lot of neurodiversity in the book. There's a lot of mentally ill characters figuring out how to support each other. A lot of people in the aftermath of a disaster trying to figure out how to support each other and how to deal with those all-powerful artificial intelligence gods that are still kind of causing trouble. So that's what the book is about.
That is a wonderful job of summing up a book that is incredibly difficult to sum up. So fantastic. But I mean, I guess you are the author, so if anybody's going to be able to, it should be you. So that makes sense.
It takes practice.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you're going to get a chance to.
Okay. Oh no.
Well, funnily enough,
my turn. Okay.
Yes, now it's your turn.
Exactly. Funnily enough, I'm about to ask you to do exactly that. So our other guest for this evening is Janelle Shane, who is an author, an AI blogger, although she's just described herself to me before the event as an AI shit poster, but we agree that that's just as valid a use of her time, and an optics researcher. And she's the author of a wonderful book called You Look Like a Thing and I Love You, which came out not so long ago. So Janelle, can you tell us a bit more about your research and your fantastic book?
Oh no, now I have to actually, so yeah, I run a machine learning humor blog called AIweirdness.com, also described as a AI shit posting blog, which is valid. It's weird experiments that I get up to. And out of that came my book called You Look Like a Thing and I Love You. And that title comes from a pickup line generated by an artificial neural network that I had trained on other pickup lines. And it sort of got the gist, maybe made some mistakes. And in that book, I kind of delve into like, well, why isn't it as amazing as the AI that we hear about that's doing all this stuff commercially in the AI and science fiction? So my book is those bright green neon things you see in the background. And don't worry about the random giraffe.
Aren't there giraffes in your book, Janelle?
There are giraffes in my book. They're a little bit of a running joke in machine learning, and I'm doing my utmost to try to like push that along in any way I can. But giraffes are pretty common in training data for AIs, not so much common in the real world. So they tend to be like over optimistically, here's a random patch of forest. AI says there's a giraffe there because in its training data, that was kind of likely. And so then they kind of have popped up as a running joke in other places. And as I said, I like to perpetuate it. Ada, any giraffes planned for the trilogy?
You never know.
Yeah.
You could fit one in book 3. We're not having any spoilers about book 3.
I was just thinking there's not a giraffe in either of these existing books. So
or consider this your invitation.
Yeah.
If you had an AI reader, you might find a giraffe.
There we go. Well, that's actually a perfect segue to my first question for you, Ada, which was about the fact that AI is such a central part of these books. And you've got these great, wonderful, unique antagonists who are these AI gods who rule the universe. And kind of the motivating plot of The Outside is that you have your fantastic central character, the scientist, Yasira. Is that how her name is pronounced in your head? Yasira?
I pronounced it Yasira.
Yasira.
I didn't listen to the audiobook, so I'm not sure if that's also how the audiobook narrator says it, but I would assume so.
I feel like you're probably the authority on this, whatever the narrator says. So we'll go with your
Well,
pronunciation.
I did have a long Skype conversation with her where she was like, how do you pronounce any of these ridiculous names? And we just went back and forth for a couple hours like that. But Yasira is what we will call her.
Okay, great. So you have your scientist, Yasira, who creates a new form of power source that basically royally pisses off the artificial intelligence gods who rule the universe. How did you come to develop this fantastic idea for an antagonist? Was it something that just came out of like pure creative juices, or was it something that came from a bit of research and interest in AI in the real world?
So the funny thing about this is that even though I have invited a person who writes about actual AI to host this with me, the artificially intelligent gods of the Outside series are not really based on any serious artificial intelligence research. There's no way we could make gods like that with our current technology. Where they come from is actually something incredibly dorky, which is that when I first started sketching out the ideas that became these books, it was because I had a crush on a Dungeons and Dragons character. And so I was like, all right, well, I have this little handful of characters from Dungeons and Dragons. I want to write about them, but I am way too proud to just write standard Dungeons and Dragons fantasy, so I'm going to put them in space. That's what I'm going to do.
As you do.
Yes. And then because if you think about the cosmology in Dungeons and Dragons, it's actually quite this odd cosmology where there's all these different powers that are all kind of in conflict with each other for various reasons, and which physically exists, but which also it's very strange, really, if you try to transplant that to any other setting. But it was something that if I didn't have something with some of those traits, then some of these characters that I especially wanted to put in space, they wouldn't make sense anymore. And so I was like, how do you put these like physically existing spiritual powers with sinister motives into a science fiction setting? And I was like, well, of course you make them AI. Like, that's the trope, right? That there's AI and it's magic and it controls our lives. And so that's what I ended up building that around.
So is this a space wizard?
No, she is not a, well, you know what?
What class was she originally?
Isira was not a Dungeons and Dragons character. I made her specially for this book, but you are actually correct. If she had been a Dungeons and Dragons character, she would be a wizard. That is the obvious choice.
Space wizards, yep.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
So it's very much getting at this idea that, like, please go ahead, Janelle.
Time lag. But so is the character you had a crush on in this book?
Yes. Unfortunately, the character I had a crush on is the villain, Akabi, who's one of the cyborg angels now who works for the AI god. So that's where he is. And then one of the other kind of antagonists, but it's complicated characters, Dr. Eviana Talir, who is completely opposed to the artificial intelligent gods. She's off doing her own cosmic horror thing. She was also originally a D&D character. So, yeah.
And how does this gel, Janelle, with your sort of what you've learned and shit posted about thus far in your Witness blog? With how far are we conceptually from being able to create AI rather than like be able to do something along the lines of what Ada is writing about in these books?
Yeah, we're, as Ada says, we are super far from that ever being remotely around reality. I mean, we do have AI applications that are causing all sorts of problems in real world harm, but usually it's because they're not smart enough to understand what they're really supposed to be doing and like what a good solution would be. And copy the humans isn't always the right answer, even though that's often what we ask them to do. And so, yeah, before I knew that the AI gods were originally D&D gods, I was kind of thinking about, so if these are originally like human written programs, did they absorb any of the preconceptions of their original programmers? Like if their original training data was humans?
Well, it's interesting you should ask that, because the other thing about these AI gods, which comes out very quickly in the books, but which I haven't mentioned yet in this broadcast, is that they eat souls. And so there's this whole thing where if you're a human who exists in the world of these books and you die, your soul kind of gets transported to one of these computer gods and is just absorbed into it, and you're part of the god now. So in a way, the books that I have out right now don't go super deeply into this philosophically. I am planning to go deeper into it in book 3, but basically the gods kind of are conglomerations of humans in one sense, even though they are also artificial intelligences. So it's you can't really draw that line quite as sharply as you instinctively want to.
No, that's interesting though, because the gods each have their own sort of flavor and preferred souls to absorb. So, if one god is absorbing all of the rebels and the heretics, does that god become more and more out there over time, or something?
That's a good question, and that's a question I'm going to be asking myself in book 3. I'm not finished writing book 3 yet, as it would be spoilers even if I was. So let's table that. All right. Maybe in a year or two we'll be talking about that.
Okay.
Which sort of begs I'm just curious about asking Ada, given so you've already conceived of this series as a trilogy, and is that sort of how it started from like the first moments you thought about adapting this story to kind of create this world for your beloved D&D character, or was it more like one book and then it grew from there?
So I sort of, I started this out and I was like, let's just make a universe that I could write a whole long series of stories in, a whole bunch of different kinds of stories. I was being very expansive with it at first. And as I figured out more about it and about what I wanted to write in it, I started narrowing it down and being like, okay, there's this one particular sequence of events that I'm very interested in. And then I wrote The Outside. And The Outside, of course, it was my first published novel. And so what everyone in the industry will tell you with your first published novel is make it a standalone with serious potential. So I wrote The Outside, and I was very careful to keep The Outside something that could either be the beginning of a series or it could be a book that stands on its own. And you just read that one book and you're like, I read a book that was great. So not there's loose ends left open. There's room for more adventures to happen after what happens in book 1, but it's not ending on a cliffhanger or anything. It's a book that you can just read. And so I sold that to Angry Robot. And meanwhile, I was noodling around thinking, okay, but if this was a series, what would I do next? And I had a vague idea of the sequence of events. I initially wanted it to be 4 books. I was like, we have The Outside, which is about setting up this conflict and having the first major events happen in this conflict. Then I have The Fallen, book 2, which is about kind of people reeling from the events of book 1 and adjusting to this new reality and the new conflicts. And then I was going to have book 3, which is these big space battles, and book 4, which is this very weird kind of, my idea for book 4 was all this very weird kind of internal stuff about the gods. And as I outlined this and tried to put it together, I was like, no, there's not actually a whole book here. I need to actually merge books 3 and 4. They need to be one thing. So now it is a trilogy. And I was like, well, I don't like that we're like obligatorily assuming everything has exactly 3 books. There's nothing special about the number 3, but it is actually working best as a trilogy, I think. That was a very long-winded answer.
But thorough. It sounds like there's potential for like a Silmarillion kind of esque, like the lore of the gods of the outside, maybe like book 4, trilogy plus 1 kind of thing.
Book 3 is still very much under development, so who knows what's going to happen. I mean, I think I know what's going to happen, and then some part of it always surprises me. So,
well, it's good. That's what you want as an author, like to be in a position where you can still be surprised by your own story as much as, you know, while you're writing it as before you conceive it. Do you have a sequel in the works for your book, Janelle?
No, not right now. I'm working on potentially a different book, but it is a different topic, so we will see.
Well, can you tell us a bit about that, or is it still secret?
I think it's still secret.
All right.
So yeah, stay tuned. But yeah.
Exciting. Okay. And so in addition to your AI research, your AI blog rather, you're an optics researcher. Can you tell us a little bit about how being an optics researcher leads to an interest in AI and kind of how the two things sort of go together?
Well, you know, you can use AI to try and solve problems in a bunch of different fields. And so the way I was using AI in optics originally was to solve a very specific problem that turns out I didn't need AI after all to solve. It was much simpler. But in the meantime, now I picked up this, I'd actually started out at AI before I did optics. And I see a lot of that crossover now between AI and these other fields. You know, they're using it for all sorts of things, including things that AI shouldn't really be kind of used for necessarily. And actually, one of them, I found it really interesting. I know, Ada, you've got a background in AI related research, like you know a lot about AI. And so one of the things I thought was interesting to see these kind of AI powered angels use is micro expression analysis. Because I'm like, wait a second, in our world, like that is a really, you know, glitchy, problematic, like generally debunked application of AI. And so here it is in this book, like how, and then as I read a little bit more, I'm wondering how well does it really work in this world? Like it seems like perhaps in this world, the micro expressions analysis is not that reliable after all. Were you thinking about that?
And it's actually not something I thought about super deeply while I was writing it, which is, I actually, for my master's degree, I did some research, which it turned out to be incredibly crappy research. And I didn't really find out anything useful from it. And it wasn't research in micro-expression detection, but it was research in something sufficiently closely related. It was like analyzing text transcripts and trying to see if we could find out who was lying, which of course you can't really, but that was, you know, you're in your master's degree and your supervisor says, want to do this cool sounding thing. And you're like, okay.
I mean, no is an answer to that.
Yeah.
Could be the answer to that question.
And so I did do enough research that I read about micro-expressions and about just humans detecting micro-expressions in other humans, which is interesting because it's one of the few ways of humans detecting these things in other humans that performs better than chance. Like humans are actually terrible at this. Like if you have a human and they're like, oh, I can tell who's lying because like, you know, they look away from me or their pupils dilate or something. It's like, no, you can't actually tell. We test you in a laboratory. You are performing at chance, and also you're ableist. Congratulations.
Yeah, that was the thing because in this book, the micro expression software fails on entirely, like completely, on one of the characters. So, Enga, who does not do facial expressions,
right?
Also does not do speaking aloud. Enga is great. Can I just say, like, I love Enga talks in all caps.
Yes.
Like, she talks by sending text messages to people and it's in all caps. And I'm like, oh, at first I was like, yeah, this is probably a feature of the text sending program. You want it to stand out from the rest of the text. Fine. It makes her sound like a really belligerent and angry and short and fed up all the time, but that's just an all caps thing. And as I'm reading further, I'm like, no, wait. She's doing this on purpose. Like there's one point where she has the choice to, I forget if it was like to run a voice encoder or something like that. And she chooses to encode that all caps speak, like that same tone of voice. I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah, she knows exactly what she's doing.
Mm-hmm.
She sounds angry and belligerent because that's how she wants to sound.
Yes.
That was great. Yeah. But yeah, the micro expressions fails entirely on her. And I'm getting all the, you have these other characters who have this software running all the time and who constantly are misjudging each other or not knowing what the other one's thinking, or just kind of like, not able to manage people very well despite having this software running. So I thought that was really interesting to see it show up and like, oh, it doesn't work that well, does it?
And I think on some level, this isn't just a conversation about microexpressions. It's a conversation about empathy, because if you're looking at someone and you're having this complicated interaction with someone and you're like, oh, they're feeling this emotion. Well, it's like, okay, maybe you can tell that they're feeling this emotion. What does that mean? What are they asking you for? What do they want you to do? Do you want to do that thing? Do they have if they have a hidden motive, what is it? All this stuff that is not reducible to emotions, but people talk about empathy as recognizing emotions, and they're just like, oh, well, if you can recognize a person's emotions, then you understand them. And I feel like, okay, there's also a lot of autism in this book, and empathy is a thing people talk about a lot with regards to autism, either autistic people who are naturally very low in empathy, who can't really figure out what emotions people are feeling, or sometimes autistic people who are very high in empathy and who notice a lot of emotions and get very overwhelmed by it. And either way, we have no idea how to deal with people. So it's something I think about a lot.
That's a really good segue, Ada, into this wonderful thing that you do on your website, which is a feature that you've been running for quite a while now called Autistic Book Party, which is a kind of great thing that I think you started off doing it solely yourself, but now you feature other writers as well. And it's about kind of highlighting books that are both by neurodivergent authors and also about neurodivergent characters or stories that feature exploration.
It can be either one. So it can be a book with autistic characters by anybody. It can be a autistic author writing about anything. It doesn't have to be #own voices, although that can, and it's great. But it's just anything in science fiction related to autism I can review it there.
And have you found that, obviously before you started that, you had an interest in this from not just from your own writing, but, presumably from reading other writers and interest in how neurodivergence is represented in fiction. Have you found from that level of involvement you've had in that and sort of reading about how other authors are representing it, whether own voices or not, that's kind of influenced or affected the way you write about it yourself or think about representation in fiction?
Well, in some ways it's been very helpful, because I started it at a point in my life. It was more than 10 years ago. It was a point in my life where I understood that these issues mattered, and that representation in fiction was a valuable thing for people, and also a thing that can be quite hurtful if you get it wrong. And I was interested in that. But in the process of actually writing all these reviews over 10 years, I realized how much there was that I didn't know. Even though I'm autistic myself, there was a lot I wasn't familiar with, because there's so much diversity within autistic people as a group. And so I ended up doing a lot more research. I ended up learning a lot, both about the autistic advocacy community and about what's out there in science fiction, what's not out there in science fiction, what people are typically doing wrong and why, what people are doing right and why. I've also seen just how the field has changed in these last 10 years. There has been, compared to what there was 10 years ago, there has just been an explosion of people who, I almost don't want to say there's been an explosion of autistic authors, because I think what we're actually seeing is an explosion of autistic authors both being aware that they're autistic and
sure.
being willing to say so in public. I think that's the culture shift we're seeing, but it has really exploded in the past few years. There's so much out there, both in traditional publishing, books like Essa Hansen's No Fat Gloss. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but and Alex White's books that are breaking in really to the big five by openly autistic authors, which is something we really didn't see before. And also in self-publishing and smaller publishing, there's so many new voices who are comfortable enough self-identifying as autistic that I almost can't keep up with it anymore. So doing all this research, becoming so intimately familiar with this topic has really made me better informed, and it's helped me think about a lot of interesting, difficult issues. I'm glad I did it. I also feel that there's a dark side to this kind of thing. And the dark side, of course, is that you overthink it. And you start writing your own story as an autistic author of autistic characters who are interesting to you. And you're like, oh no, what if I get it wrong? What if I'm problematic? Oh no. And you have to kind of turn off that voice while you're drafting. You can like bring it back in revisions, but you have to, when you develop a critical brain, you have to also develop the capacity to turn it off temporarily when you need, just so you can get the words out. Sure. That's what I've found, and that's been a challenge for me at sometimes.
So separating those like creative and critical faculties, which are obviously both incredibly useful and, you know, have their own place, but being able to turn them on and off selectively and like know when both are best sort of embraced.
And of course they can complement each other. You can do a lot in revisions thinking critically about your own work, but you have to know when to use it and when not to. That's what I found.
Wonderful. One of the things that we've seen over the last couple of days, Janelle, which has been amazing while we've been promoting this event, is some of the amazing work you've done with, is it neural networks that you've been using to create these images, or is it a different kind of AI training that has been employed?
Yeah, I think there's neural networks built in these. So these are big AI models that I did not train myself, and they were actually never meant to be jammed together. And I also was not the person who jammed them together. But what you have is a it's an image judging algorithm that was trained on a whole bunch of internet images. And then you have another algorithm that will present example images to the image judging algorithm. The judging one says, oh, does that look like a giraffe? No, that one looks more like a giraffe. Go make something more like that. And so this image generating algorithm with feedback from the judging one will kind of drive its way toward hopefully something that the judging algorithm says, yeah, you know, that's a giraffe or whatever. And so what I love about doing stuff from Ada's books is that this sort of aesthetic really lends itself very well to generated imagery. So here I took first sentence of the book description, which is, the laws of physics acting on the planet of Jai have been forever upended, its surface completely altered, and its inhabitants permanently changed, causing chaos. And this is what we got out of that algorithm given that description. And yes, there is chaos. There is a planet. The aesthetic was still maybe a little golden and happy, but one of the things I can do is add some extra things to try and steer it. So I'm going to grab another iteration of that. So in this particular one, I added the sentences dramatic, atmospheric, and ominous, and matte painting. And I got this, something's happening to this planet, which is kind of in line with what we wanted, but it's, it almost looks kind of more like a factory planet. And it's not a spoiler to say that this planet, the book that The Fallen takes place on, is described as very lush. And so I did some experimenting with that and I added in vines and I added in tentacles. as you do, and came up with another image.
This is my favorite.
No.
These are amazing. It's so cool.
Exactly what it looks like in the book. You nailed it.
I put in a waterfall. It put in a waterfall. Like, I didn't tell it to put in a waterfall. I didn't tell it there were buildings. It decided there were buildings and, sky tentacle grape things. And so, of course, Angry Robots Twitter started talking about eldritch space wine, as you do. And so I had a go at generating some eldritch space wine. Actually, this is my first go at generating eldritch space wine, and yes, but also no, absolutely not. So I had to do some, fortunately you can drive it in negative direction, so I drove it away from the word worms, in the opposite direction as far as it could go, because I'm like, yes, but no, absolutely no. And it did get a little bit better. So let me grab that. Yeah. So
now we're talking. This I would actually drink.
Which part of it could you drink? I'm not sure.
I mean, there's a recognizable bottle shape in there. You could just pour out whatever's in that bottle.
Yeah.
This thing at the bottom left.
Guaranteed.
Yeah, it's the bottle hovering over that purple glowing sphere.
I feel like I should just be able to pick up the purple glowing sphere and squeeze that into a glass or something, which would be a very Eldritch Space Wine way of delivering Eldritch Space Wine.
Yeah.
So this is when you're using the words that kind of define the image, it's telling a neural net to sort of pull together images that kind of match that description from an image bank. Is that essentially what's happening?
It's not even doing that. It is almost, you can think of it as sculpting different parts of the image. So it's changing sections of the image, not just pixel by pixel, but chunks of pixel by chunks of pixel, kind of distributed functions. And it's saying, okay, does it look more like Eldritch Space Wine if we make this collection of pixels blue? And the judging algorithm says, yes, keep going. And now, okay, no, that's too blue. Or let's have a bunch of round things. Is that kind of lighting up the yes, Eldritch Space Wine neurons?
Wow. So it's very iterative in terms of it checks constantly and then tries again.
Yeah.
Wow.
And this is all based on words that it has seen associated with images on the internet. And it's seen so much internet stuff that it's really astonishing what it can do. I want to show one more picture that I generated, which is this was a few people in the cavernous interior of a spaceship filled with mysterious devices that can create portals. And
that is the thing that happens in the Fallen.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. This happens. And
I like how all their clothes kind of match. There's a color scheme even with their clothes. That's kind of cool.
I specified the color scheme so I could add extra. And if I said, okay, with orange and green. And actually, come to think of it, I did say the word orange, which could explain all the orange spheres. If those are literal oranges now. Someone has brought into the spaceship. Yeah.
Incredible. This makes me think, can we use this sort of process to create book covers? The hardest part of having a book cover design that matches the description of a book is sometimes conveying what is the book about or what's it supposed to look like to an artist, and that process of and it's like a game of telephone. The idea gets transmitted through so many people that you can't sort of translate it, but this way you kind of cut out the middlemen and teach a computer to do it. But then you've got to license an AI to give you a piece of artwork. I don't know how the legal side of that works for producing something commercially. It would be a fascinating discussion to have.
Yeah, I guess you could produce an interesting mood board. The problem is you don't, if you look at any one of those faces or like anything that's supposed to be an actual real object, when you look closely at it, you're like, no, actually, this does not work. It's way better at lighting and textures and stuff. Although that said, I really love the covers of both The Outside and The Fallen. Those came out so well.
They're by Lee Gibbons. I love what he's done with them.
Did an amazing job. I love that the second book is so different to the first, and yet you can still tell that they're kind of in the same world and the same characters.
It's got that swirly motif.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Fantastic. No, they're gorgeous. Cool. Well, we had a great chat with just the three of us, but we've also been lucky enough to get a couple of audience questions through. So I'll introduce those so we can get an answer to a question. One person asked, you mentioned, Ada, about being kind of surprised by the stories you write as you write them, like, the situations that a character finds himself in, or, what's going to happen with the plot. To what extent do you kind of plot out the book before you start it? Like, is it you have a bare structure and you kind of go from point to point and then the book emerges from that, or is it a little bit more detailed or free form, or kind of what's the process for you?
Well, so I always write from an outline. I always have to know where I'm going and at least approximately how I'm going to get there. And that can be, depending on how I'm feeling when I write the book, that can be, I've tried more detailed outlines, I've tried less detailed outlines, but either way, I know the skeleton of what the story is, and I have some really vivid mental images of certain scenes. But as I go along writing the book, to meet that outline, I find that I get surprised in particular by the emotional nuances of what's going on.
Right.
I find that the way characters approach things as they're moving through the plot starts to surprise me and to be really a lot richer than what I initially envisioned when it was this big wide angle list of plot points, and that can, sometimes that goes far enough that it actually changes the plot. Like there were aspects of the Outside's plot, especially in the second half, that ended up not matching the outline. And I was like, oh, okay, so she's not escaping from, that would be a spoiler. Okay, never mind. I'm not going to tell you the difference between the book and the outline because it's pretty far along in the book and it would be spoilers. But
okay.
Yeah, but other times it's just like, oh, that hit differently than I was expecting. Or, oh, that character's taking a different attitude than I was expecting. Or it's stuff like that. The really chewy emotional parts are the ones that surprise me. And of course, then there's also revisions. You hand in the book to your agent and your agent's like, oh, I think we need this to happen instead of this. And you're like, oh, shit, you're right. So that happens too. And that can surprise you as well. So, yeah.
Great. And again, it's wonderful to be able to be surprised by your own writing. So I think it's something maybe a lot of people who aren't writers don't realize is part of the process necessarily. So yeah, fantastic. Someone also asked a question for you, Janelle. They're wondering what the weirdest, I imagine given everything we've seen thus far, this might be a very difficult question to answer, but what's the weirdest kind of image you've seen generated from one of your prompts that you put in, or perhaps say an unexpected kind of result you've got from something that maybe was quite a benign sort of inquiry in the first place?
Oh, let's see. I guess right now I am working on trying to get one to generate a chair, like just a chair made out of a particular kind of wood. And I am astonished at how difficult that is, because you see like these lush textures and these mountains and the atmosphere and the lighting is hitting the mountain. You're like, it can do a chair. It cannot do a chair. Like you ask for a chair and like the entire universe is covered in whatever wood you imagine this chair should be. And it's like trying to carve a chair out of this wood, and it's got like, there's nowhere to sit. There's way too many legs, or it's just, oh man, that, these sorts of, it always surprises me what things I'm asking AI to do end up being like adversarial. Like I was like, here's an easy one. Give me a nice pretty chair. And it is difficult. And yeah, I tend to try to do that, but I'm always surprised when I succeed and don't in places where I didn't expect.
Okay. Is that because I mean, when you picture, like you say, chair to someone, and I feel like most people can think of something that's roughly similar of like, 4 wooden legs and a square seat and a square back or something. But obviously chairs come in a basically infinite variety. Is that the problem? That
Yeah. No,
like
I said
what we think of as a chair is
tried to get specific. I'm like dining room chair, and like they
right?
they
Wow.
have 4 legs, and it was all over the place. And I gave it like a starting image of a chair. It's like, okay, start from that, make it out of this other wood, and it's like, and the chair just kind of, morphs into something that's not very much a chair anymore, and it's getting farther and farther from chairness. So, oh, the other thing that surprised me and delighted me is I was trying to generate variations on a herd of sheep grazing, and I was trying the styles of different painters. I tried Bob Ross, and all the sheep ended up with little Bob Ross hair, like little brown, fluffy heads on all.
We're going to have to ask you to share that after the event. There's no way I can live the rest of my life without seeing the Bob Ross sheep. That's amazing.
Man. If the next question is for Ada, I might be able to pick it up. Go find it while.
Funnily enough, the next question is for Ada. So we'll try and if you can give a nice long answer to this one, Ada, maybe Janelle will be able to furnish us with some Bob Ross sheep.
I'm sure I won't have a problem with that. I'm very long-winded.
Okay, wonderful. Jesse said that he loved seeing the variety and range of neurodiverse characters that have appeared in the books. Did you find that they were all kind of similarly easy to write, or did they come to you with the same kind of degree of, or maybe it's less a question about neurodiversity specifically, but just like, are neurodiverse characters, do you write them differently to the way you write non-neurodiverse characters, or if that's a conscious process of writing a range and variety of characters who represent or are represented differently? How conscious or unconscious is that process, I guess?
That's a very interesting question because, a lot of the time it is not conscious. When I started out on the draft of The Outside, I knew basically who Dr. Tillier was as a person. I knew she had this kind of spacey way of talking, like, okay, she's kind of crazy because she's a cosmic horror cultist and they're all kind of crazy, right? And I was like, this is problematic because crazy cultist is a problematic trope, but I was like, I like her, so I'm just going to run with this and see what happens. And I didn't realize, I had suspicions that she herself might be autistic, but I wasn't sure what to do with them because I was like, oh, this is problematic. And it wasn't until I was partway through the draft that I was like, no, like not only am I writing this character as being kind of autistic, but everything that's interesting about her and actually has depth about her comes from the fact that she's kind of autistic. And also my protagonist is kind of autistic too. And I didn't realize at first, but she is. So I had to go back in the draft. There's my cat. I had to go back in the draft and actually make that more explicit and then think more about what its implications were for both characters. And so that was something that kind of almost happened despite me. And the other times it's very deliberate. Like by the time I got to The Fallen and I was introducing, there's several new characters in The Fallen who are also neurodiverse. And by that time I had enough of a handle on the world and on how I was handling neurodiversity and mental illness and trauma in this particular world that I was just like, okay, so we're going to have a bunch of people and they're all going to have been mentally affected by outside in some way. And I'll base them loosely on different kinds of people that I know, I guess. And that was relatively straightforward compared to the process with Ysera and Ev.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Wonderful. That's a really interesting and good answer. And it's perfect timing as well, because Janelle has, true to her word, managed to pull out for us this incredible picture. I can only see a tiny version of it on my screen, and I just know that it's going to be amazing when I blow it up. And here it is. Oh my God. This is amazing.
It's a herd of sheep grazing on a lush green hillside in the style of Bob Ross.
That's incredible.
Which,
in Rio de Janeiro, by the looks of the hills behind it.
Yeah, I mean, it really did change. It made the composition a lot better. This is actually one of the better compositions-wise pictures I've gotten out of this particular experiment. But yeah, slight downside or upside, depending on how you look at it, is the sheep.
Thank you for that. What an amazing thing to have. Well, we've got time for one more question. I absolutely have to squeeze this in because I remember seeing this on your Twitter last year, Ada, and just immediately thinking I've never wanted a book more in my life. I still haven't got a copy yet, but I do need to track one down. You published a book last year called Millionaire Elegies, which is a collection of poems about fossils and dinosaurs. Is that right?
Yes, except that it was not last year, it was March.
It was March this year. God,
it was March this year. Yes, we're all in pandemic time. Everything is every year.
I mean, this basically sounds like the perfect book to me. Can you tell us a little bit more about it and sort of where it came from and what the genesis of it was?
So Millionaire Elegies is the first poetry collection I've ever written. I had published poetry before, but it was either individual poems or it was in my other collection, Monsters in My Mind, which is both short fiction and poetry.
Mm-hmm.
So Millionaire Elegies is, I call it my dinosaur poetry book because you say dinosaur poetry and everyone's like, yes, I want to read that book.
Exactly.
It is, there are quite a few poems about dinosaurs in there. There are also poems about ancient life, both before and after the dinosaurs. It's really kind of a journey all the way from the late heavy bombardment to the present day. And it's just a lot of poems either in the voices of these ancient creatures or speaking to them in some way or talking about the humans who discovered them in their bones and kind of interpreted what those bones meant in kind of this very subjective human way, because you can't actually, something happened millions of years ago and you try to interpret that and you're inevitably projecting your own human concerns onto it. And I'm doing that too as I write the poems. Mm-hmm. So there's just like, there's a lot of fun dinosaur stuff. There's also a lot about trauma and survival, because I guess I keep coming back to that in my writing. And there's a lot about, I guess, predators and prey and extinctions and exciting, grim stuff. But yeah, there's some happy poems in there too somewhere. But
there's a lot of
it. Sounds fantastic.
Yes.
Perfect. Well, I mean, if I wasn't ready to go out and grab one before, I am absolutely, first thing I'm doing as soon as this event is over is finally getting myself a copy.
Excellent.
I think that's a wonderful note for us to end on. God, we've covered so much ground tonight between dinosaurs and Bob Ross sheep and neurodiversity and AI gods. I mean, I don't think so short a book event has ever covered so much ground. Thank you so much to Ada Hoffmann and Janelle Shane for joining us tonight to help celebrate the release of The Fallen. The Fallen is available now everywhere, both from independent bookshops and from chains and from every online retailer you can think of. As with every Angry Robot book, if you buy a copy of The Fallen from your local independent bookstore or a not-so-local independent bookstore, we're very happy to give you a digital copy of the book for free, because we want everyone to feel like they can support independent bookshops and also read their books wherever and however they want. So get in touch with us on Twitter or via the contact form on our website if you've bought a copy of The Fallen. Also go out and grab yourself a copy if you look like a thing, and I love you if you love AI shitposting and fascinating popular science books with a humorous twist, because who doesn't love that? Thank you again to both our guests for joining us. Thank you everyone who has tuned in. Thank you to you if you're watching this on catch up on YouTube or Facebook. Keep an eye out on both our YouTube and Facebook pages, and also on our Twitter and website for more launch events in the future. I'm sure we'll be all back here again in a year or two to celebrate the release of the third book in the Outside trilogy. And who knows how many more books will follow up.
If we're not, then there's something wrong.
Fantastic. There we go. That we're committed now. All right. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, both. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you soon somewhere else in the internet via Angry Robot. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Bye.